comfortable for all of us is if I speak actually about what the lab has done in the 25 years of its existence. And in the middle, I'll tell you a little bit about some principles of operation that emerged over time. And then at the end, I want to show you something which may not be particularly scholarly, but maybe still hopefully interesting enough, and that is, some of you know that a couple of years ago we have tried to do a lineage of the lab to try to find out where we are coming from. So I finally did it from beginning to end, and I'll show it to you. And let me just give you, those of you who do not know, there's one thing that this lineage proves beyond doubt, and that is that it was Leibniz, not Newton, who invented calculus and everything else. Okay, so let's start a little bit with prehistory. Prehistory with this starts with Paul Kalata, who was my advisor, and who was, I want to tell you, a very generous and good advisor in the sense that he was, on one hand, he allowed me to do work that I wanted to do with relatively guarded guidance. I was not really very constrained under his tutelage, and I learned from him. That was very useful. Though, as you'll see in a minute, there is also a downside to that. And the other thing I want to tell you about Paul Kalata is that I did not realize until years later how much effort he had to expend in order to send me to all the places that he sent me. During the time that I was his student, I went to every American Control Conference and every CDC, Control and Decision Conference, no matter where it was, no matter for how long I wanted to go. I did not realize at the time that for him this was a huge struggle to find the funds to do that, and I didn't realize sometimes why he sends me and he's not coming himself, which I understood a little bit later when I started understanding the finances of it. And he certainly, I owe him a deep depth of gratitude for what he had done for me. Now, when I met Paul Kalata for the first time, this is my first or second paper with him, the problem that we studied was a problem that the Air Force Office of Scientific Research gave us. There was a target, there was a beam, the beam was Gaussian, and the idea was to do target tracking. And Paul Kalata is a very good researcher in the area of Kalman filtering, and I did not know so much about Kalman filtering, but I knew relatively much about harmonic decomposition, so we started competing between the two, and it ended up to be a very interesting thesis as a result of this. And in the course of it, I fell in love with this book. This is a table. This is a table of integrals and series of sums and sequences and such. It is a book with long history. It started, actually, the first author should be Rizhik. He was the first person who wrote it. Rizhik died of starvation in Stalingrad during World War II. Gradstein continued, and this is basically the most comprehensive table that existed before the internet made it essentially infinite. And what happened to me as I saw this book, I started actually, if you believe it or not, this is a book that's very interesting to read. Take it in your hands, and look at it. And I fell in love with one particular issue, which was how to take the band-limited noise and run it through this Gaussian, I mentioned the Gaussian beam, right? And so instead of doing most of the work that Paul Kalata wanted me to do, I actually started working on this mathematical work with Gradstein and Rizhik's book, and we published the first paper. We published my first paper on the transaction of information theory. That was, I want to tell you, just personally very important to me, because I always looked at the transaction of information theory when I was a student in Tel Aviv as basically the citadel of science, and I thought that if I published there, I can die immediately after that, and that would suffice. I did what I was supposed to do. So I published that paper. This was my master of thesis paper, and then Roger Chen enters the picture. Let me explain. I did a lot of teaching at the time. I did a lot of teaching because there was no RA money, so I was a full TA, and I was actually given classes to teach. And at one year, I taught E4 13, which was a circuits class. In the circuits class, the six there there's this fellow, I learned later that he was Roger Cheng, and he's basically sitting there looking at what I'm doing. My advisor, Paul Colata, fell ill, and I had to do actually the whole class. And as I teach the class, every time I feel that what I'm doing may not be 100% accurate or something is wrong in my notes, Roger Cheng started moving. and then I started becoming really frightened of him because sometimes he started moving when I did not think that I'm wrong. And I started talking to him, and he was very impressive. Paul Colata was ill, and Paul Colata has a little bit of money from the Air Force at the time already. So when he came back, he asked me how things are going. He said, listen, I've done something terrible, and I understand that I've done something which is inexcusable, and if you're going to undo what I have done, that's okay. So he said, so what have you done? I said, I hired you an assistant, because I hired Roger Cheng. And Paul Colata, to his merit, said that if I felt that we need another assistant, then I hired him, that's okay. And again, I really appreciate it because I didn't realize at the time what I'm doing. I put a huge financial burden on Paul Colata. But you know something, everybody benefited from that because Roger Cheng was really great. And Roger Cheng was really my first student. He was really an undergraduate student at the time. He got his PhD from Princeton. He's now a professor in Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And it gave me great personal satisfaction. I happened to have been in Hong Kong when he received his fellow grade from IEEE, and I felt like in heaven. So then I started working on my PhD thesis. Again, we are in prehistory, and I had a very serious setback. Part of it has to do with the fact that if you give your student too much freedom, there is also a cost to that. And the problem was that I developed this information theoretic interpretation of stability and observability, and I went to Minneapolis with Roger Cheng, and we slept in the house of my aunt in Minneapolis. And we went to the conference, and I presented that, in fact, I had a special session about this topic. And someone sits at the back as I'm presenting this wonderful work on how capacity behaves in the stability region and how it behaves outside the stability region. And I'm explaining that capacity outside the stability region actually vanishes after a time. It was a beautiful work, I thought. And this fellow sits at the end and he says, I think it's wrong. And he explained why it was wrong, and here was my problem. My problem was that he used mathematical terms that in his question, in the ACC, in the presence of about 40 other people, he thought it was wrong, and he explained to me why it was wrong, but I didn't understand what he's saying. In other words, I did not have the mathematical background. He used mathematics beyond what I knew. So you sit there and you want to die. Don't worry about it. There are other people in the audience who did understand. And a very lively debate, well above my head, has developed, where they have convinced him that he was wrong. So in other words, I was okay, and I continued, except that we went home and we tried to explain to ourselves what he said. And instead of going to the ACC the next day, we stayed at my aunt's and we tried to see if we can resolve the issue that he raised, and we could not resolve the issue that he has raised. And we went on Friday to the ACC, and we continued to work in Philadelphia on this. And at the time, I already had the second paper accepted to IEEE Transactional Information Theory. And on the Friday after that, it arrives with the Gali proofs have arrived. It was already after acceptance. And you have like this immense ethical problem what to do, right? You're not sure it's correct. The IEEE Transactional Information Theory has accepted your paper, you know, it's important for job interview, you know, it's fantastic. And I don't want to get into the debate, but eventually I withdrew the paper. And I'm very glad I withdrew the paper, because years after that, I mean, I still believe that the result is correct, and I still cannot prove it, now that I know much more mathematics. I think it's correct, I think these graphs are correct, but I cannot prove it, and I think that it was a good thing to take it out. It's always good to do it, because if you don't do it, someone may rely on it and stumble. And I don't have time to tell you all the stories, but I once stumbled very badly. In fact, once is here. The reason that my result is wrong is because someone has published a result which was wrong. And when I asked him, when I called him about it, as soon as I started saying, I'm calling you about this and that paper, he said, yeah, there was a mistake there. And did you publish a correction? No. I said, why? He said, we didn't think anybody is reading this stuff. Well, I was reading this stuff. Anyway, so the first journal paper really was the work that I've done with Roger Cheng. And at that time I started working on neural networks. This is a journal paper about neural networks, and you can see Markov chains there. And this is the time that there was another book, and I did not put here Populis's Stochastics and Random Variable, which is the third masterpiece. These are 3 books that I have 17 copies of, and they are on my desk, and they are in my house, and they are under my bed, because these are like books that I always like. All my work actually is interpretation of these books, and if I actually knew what's written in these 3 books, I would have been a very happy man. I started working with, my first student was Jeff Wilcox. The funding came from Peter Hertzfeld, who hired me for a year as a research assistant professor. And we did some work on optical phase shifters. And I mentioned Jeff Wilcox because he was my first master student, my first graduate student, and because of the fact that he is today vice president of Lockheed Martin. So he has done well in life. And several students, including some of you, have done phenomenally well in life. I never thought that it is because of me that you have done very well in life. I think that actually I've been very, very lucky to have you. You are so talented, and look what you have done. Amit Gopher was my first PhD student. Some of you know him. He was at Drexel recently to receive an honorary doctorate. And Amit Gopher has done work at the time also on optical phase arrays. And this again was work that Peter Hertzfeld has funded, so we continue to work in this field. Now, as many of you know, Amit, who is shown here on the right, is the development of a series of machines that allow individuals who are paralyzed to walk. And he recently received from one of them approval of the FDA for use